Which desktop environment is for you? Should you use GNOME or should you use KDE? Well, let's find out on the first episode of Linux Wars. So let's just jump into it. If you don't know what a desktop environment is, it's basically the interface for your Linux system. So Linux is modular. You can switch out several different components of the system, and one of those things is the desktop environment, and that kind of dictates what the UI of your whole entire system is going to look like. Now, there's several other desktop environments, but this video we're just going to compare GNOME and KDE because those are the sort of the two main desktop environments. There's also the Cosmic desktop environment, which is brand new, just came out recently. And the reason I am mentioning this one in particular is because some people think that this project might evolve to eventually become the third major desktop environment alongside KDE and GNOME. As you can see here, these are just two desktop options. There's several other different ones, and I'm going to be making quite a few desktop comparison videos to come. Now, both of these desktop environments come with their own sort of ecosystems for apps and everything. So right here we have the core GNOME apps, and these are all of the apps that will typically come with a GNOME system. And then we also have the GNOME Circle applications, which are just a bunch of community maintained applications for certain things that are designed to fit well with sort of the GNOME workflow. All of these apps adhere to the GNOME interface guidelines, so what that means is all of your GNOME apps are going to have sort of a similar UI, and they're going to be super consistent. Once you learn how to use one GNOME app, you kind of know how to use all of the GNOME apps. KDE also has its own app ecosystem. They don't really have a separation between core and community apps, but they do have a lot more than GNOME. And while KDE does have its own human interface guidelines similar to GNOME, they don't seem to be followed as closely to a T as the GNOME human interface guidelines are. With that said, I'm going to be eventually doing an entire video on all of the different ecosystems on Linux, because similar to the desktop environments, GNOME and KDE are not the only ecosystems either. These are just the two main ones, and a lot of other desktop environments incorporate apps from either. And so now the question is, which one should you use? GNOME or KDE Plasma? The answer is there isn't a particular best desktop environment because they all have differences in how they look, how they function, what the workflow is like, how you customize them, and things like that. And so it's more of a personal preference answer. So we're going to be doing a side-by-side comparison here so that you can see what these two different desktop environments look like, and then you can pick between them based on some of the things out of the desktops you want the most. And let's start with the default workflows, just all of the defaults. For some people, this layout may look like a Mac, although the workflow is quite a bit different than a Mac because they designed the default experience to give you a very specific workflow, and you're kind of supposed to learn how to use it the way they want you to use it, although if you customize it, you can switch it to a workflow that you're more familiar with or that you like more. Now, if we click up here, this will bring you to the activities view, and then you're going to have your pinned apps on the bottom here, so you can quickly launch them from the bottom. And then if we click show applications, it's going to give us a little full screen app launcher here that contains all of your applications. And it's kind of similar to an iPhone or an iPad home screen where you get to decide whichever order you want your applications menu to be in, but if you install a new app, it just puts it last onto the last page. And so if I move an application over here, as you can see, I can sort of scroll through these pages. Now, one thing that GNOME is very known for is everything around it is going to have like a nice fluid animation. Everything sort of just forms together. Now, I am using this in a virtualized environment, so the animations are a bit laggy here just because it's a virtual machine. But if I go onto my main system here, I am using a customized version of GNOME that is designed for my Linux distro StillOS. But as you can see, all of these animations are just super buttery smooth, and that's part of why people love GNOME so much. Now, another thing you need to know about GNOME is it's very workspace reliant. So if I hold the Windows key and scroll, it's going to switch workspaces. So it's actually switching to Plasma here because it's doing this on my main system and not actually the virtual machine. But yeah, I can switch workspaces just by holding the Windows key and scrolling. If you have a trackpad, you can also switch between workspaces using a 3-finger swipe. Hitting the Windows key brings up the overview, and hitting Windows key A will also bring up your application launcher. And if you have a trackpad, there's also a swipe gesture for that. So I actually love using GNOME with a trackpad on a laptop because the desktop environment is designed for that experience to be first class, and it makes it really nice for multitasking. And with this workspace driven workflow, I can just drag whatever applications I want to use into a workspace, as you can see here. And then now I could just simply switch between all of my different workspaces. And out of the box, there's no taskbar. There's not even a way to bring up the dock. You're kind of supposed to use the overview for any sort of application switching or multitasking. Now, the last thing I want to show off about the GNOME workflow is you can launch apps really quick just by hitting the Windows key on your keyboard. And then from here, all you have to do is start typing. And then I can hit enter. And there's Firefox. That's probably my favorite feature of GNOME, is that it's so quick to jump to things with my keyboard using the Windows key, because all you have to do is type and hit enter. I don't have to scroll through anything or move my mouse to even open an application. I can just jump straight to it with this keyboard-driven workflow. Now for KDE, out of the box, you're going to get something that looks a little bit more like a Windows 7 or Windows 10 environment. So if we open the menu here on the bottom left, by default, it shows your favorites / pinned apps, just like a Windows 10 or 11 start menu. And then if we go here to all applications, it will list all of your apps inside a little list right here. And then we have different categories right here that contain different application categories. Then next to it, we have a simple Windows 7, Windows 10 style application launcher right here. This functionally acts the same as Windows 7 and above. Nothing special here. One thing I like about KDE Plasma right here is you have a little default floating panel, but as soon as you maximize a window, it stops floating and full screens itself. So Plasma is a great option if you're coming from Windows and you don't want to have to learn a new workflow / interface. Next up, let's talk about customization, because KDE and GNOME are both pretty customizable, but your ways of going about customizing it are very different. Now for this, I'm going to start with KDE because it's a lot easier to get going customizing with KDE. We open system settings right here. Instantly, it will give us a light theme, a dark theme, and a automatic switching theme where it uses breeze during the day and breeze dark at night. And if you click these arrows right here, it will show you other light themes right here and other dark themes right here. And let's actually go over to the global theme area, which will give you even more theming options. So right here, you can set the colors of your desktop right here. If we go to get new, it ends up loading a huge variety of different color schemes and options that you might want. Now application style, this directly shows how like buttons and widgets look and how they're rendered in a window. So if I switch it to, let's say this, now I have a little Windows 95 styled look. I don't know if this looks good, but we have Fusion right here, which is more old school, but I'm going to keep it default to Breeze. Plasma style, similar thing as the application style, but just for the desktop environment. Window decorations, this would be your window borders. You can set your icon packs, your cursor, your system sounds, what your splash screen looks like, and what your login screen looks like. And this Get New button is available for all of these, well, except for the login screens. And so it's very easy to give yourself a whole system overhaul. And that's one of the things people love about KDE. Additionally, if I want to change the layout of the desktop, all I have to do, right click a panel, I can go to Add or Manage Widgets. And this is going to give me all sorts of different widgets I can add to the panel here. You can also put widgets on your desktop, so kind of like Windows 7. And if I click here, I can actually add a whole new panel to the top right here. If I click on it, it'll give me some extra options for the panels. So I can do things like disable panel floating, change the size of the panel. I can make it auto hide or dodge windows. I can move it around. Pretty much whatever you want to do with KDE's layout, you can do it. KDE even has its own GNOME style overview, so if you want to use a GNOME workflow on KDE, you can. Although it isn't as intertwined and integrated with the system as GNOME is. KDE was kind of an extra feature added, whereas GNOME is kind of designed around this whole overview system. But the point is, you can customize KDE to look however you want, and if you want KDE to be like GNOME, you can make KDE be like GNOME. Now, out of the box, GNOME's customization is severely more limited. If we go over the settings and appearance, pretty much the only options you get is you get light mode or dark mode, and you can set whatever you want your accent color to be, but that's just about it. That said, GNOME can be a lot more customizable if you install just a couple pieces of software. The first thing I'm going to install is Extension Manager here, and we'll get to that in a second. The second thing I'm going to install is a little tool called Refine. Now, if you used to use GNOME back in the day, you might know of GNOME Tweaks. That isn't really maintained anymore. Refine is sort of the replacement for GNOME Tweaks. Now let's start with the Refine tool. This lets you enable a experimental full light mode. So this actually makes the desktop itself in light mode instead of just your applications. There's also some font options, and you can change how wallpaper adjustment works. Now the GDK theme doesn't apply to most GNOME apps because they use a custom platform specific library called libadwaita. And this sort of hard codes a specific GNOME look to all of your applications. And the reason they do this is because they don't want distributions to be shipping custom themes that completely breaks GNOME apps. And unlike KDE, it doesn't give you an option to quickly download GDK themes. It is pretty easy to change your icon theme, although there aren't really any pre-installed icon themes either. You have to install those manually, which isn't hard to do, but has a small learning curve. In this tool, you also have mouse and touchpad options. You can show power buttons in the lock screen, change some shell and compositor settings, things along that nature. Now, the extensions is where the real customization comes in. So I did mention that both of these are very customizable. Plasma as a desktop gives you a very easy ability to customize pretty much everything you would want, but GNOME shell is actually written in JavaScript, and so these extensions are all JavaScript extensions essentially that modify how the JavaScript shell for GNOME works, which means that extensions can be super powerful and completely overhaul how the system works. For example, a very popular extension is Blur My Shell. If I install this turns GNOME into a very beautiful desktop that gives it a nice blur on top of your wallpaper, and it really helps GNOME feel like your own. If I go over to installed here in settings, you can change how the blur effect is applied here. So I personally like to turn my blur up and turn the brightness a little bit down, and I then go to the noise and I add some noise to it. And now I have a very beautiful black sort of dark looking theme based on my wallpaper here. Now some other extensions that significantly change the layout is Dash to Panel. This is a very popular extension, and installing this turns the default layout to be a lot more like Windows right here. So now we have a real taskbar and a panel, and if we right click it, go to Dash to Panel settings, we have all these different options for the panel. You can rearrange just about everything with the Dash to Panel extension. And if, let's say, we don't like this full screen menu, we can install this other very popular extension, Arc Menu, and this is going to give you a Windows 7 style menu here. And if I go to Dash to Panel settings here and hide the application button, we can now make that our main menu. And just like Dash to Panel, this is very customizable, so I can go to Arc Menu settings here. If I go to menu layout, we have all these different types of menu layouts right here. So if I want something like Windows 10 like, I can click this, and this will give me a Windows 10 style menu layout right here. And there's all sorts of different options for menu layouts with this extension. Now the last extension I'm going to show off real quick that a lot of people love, that is an alternative to Dash to Panel, is Dash to Dock. So if I install this real quick, now I have a dock in my system without having to go to the overview. And just like Dash to Panel, this is very customizable. I can open here, switch out the position, turn off certain things, like if for some reason I don't want the show app icon, I can get rid of that. I like to enable a shrink the dash option, which makes it a little smaller. And with this turns GNOME from the least customizable desktop to the most customizable desktop if you know how to code a GNOME extension. Now I'm going to show off two more extensions later when we get to the tips area of this video. Next up, I want to show a very overlooked point that a lot of people seem to miss, and that is app integration with other desktop apps. Both these desktops have sort of their own app ecosystems. However, both platforms tend to sort of treat the other app ecosystem as second-class citizens, although not equally, because as I'm about to demonstrate, one of these desktop environments just doesn't even try, whereas the other one at least tries, but it sort of varies how well it works. So let's start with GNOME. Now, when you're running a app that is made for the other ecosystem, I highly recommend using Flatpak, because if you don't, there's a very strong chance that a bunch of random dependencies can get pulled in, and then there's actually a saying called getting GNOME, where you install a GNOME app on KDE and it will end up installing the entire GNOME desktop onto your system, and then when you reboot, you got gnomed. That doesn't only happen with GNOME, it's just a lot more common with GNOME, but I've had it happen to me with KDE too. I've actually gotten plasma'd, but I've never gotten gnomed. Although last time I got plasma'd was like 5 years ago. So with that, I recommend using Flatpaks because it prevents that from happening to you. In fact, using Flatpak is probably why it hasn't ever gotten gnomed and why it's been so long since I've gotten plasma'd. For the sake of comparison, I'm going to install Kate, which is KDE's text editor, on GNOME, and I ended up installing GNOME text editor on KDE. This is what a libid Weta app looks like on a KDE desktop. It does use the Breeze icons here rather than the GNOME icons, so there may be situations where if Breeze doesn't contain an icon that a GNOME app uses, it will show a missing image. And then also the KDE window icons are put inside of these buttons, which is not normal for a regular KDE app. It doesn't look too bad, but it does look very out of place. GNOME, on the other hand, for a Flatpak, it does use the default KDE color style, but as you can see, this title bar here has blurry and bold text. This close button right here is 100% KDE's close button. The windows don't even have window shadows, which if I open like another window for this application, not having the window shadows here makes it blend into the background of the previous application. I don't know if this is a fault with GNOME or with Qt, which is the toolkit KDE apps use, but come on, man. This is terrible. Next up, let's talk about the system resource use. I probably should have done this as the first thing I showed off just for the best apples to apples comparison, but I didn't, so I'm gonna restart these systems real quick so that we can get a fresh boot to test out the resources. Now if we open up the system monitors here, damn, somehow it looks like we're using 2 gigabytes of RAM on KDE out of 4, but we're only using about 2 to 3% of the CPU usage in our virtual machine. I did not expect this memory usage, but it seems like it's almost entirely background services. Yeah, in HTOP I'm using 2 gigabytes of RAM too. That's crazy. Alright, normally when I use KDE Plasma, it uses around 700 megabytes of RAM, so this result here is actually surprising me. But it is a virtual machine, so take it with a grain of salt and maybe run this test on your own hardware. GNOME, on the other hand, for me, is using 1.7 gigabytes of RAM, which is about what I would expect for a GNOME desktop. It looks like now with the system monitor open, it's using 1.8. But yeah, I've seen GNOME installs go as light as 800 megabytes, while I've seen Plasma go as light as about 700. So normally for me, Plasma is a little bit lighter weight than GNOME, but I guess that might not be the case anymore. Oh, GNOME is using a bit more CPU usage than Plasma is on idle though, so that is worth noting, but that also could be this system monitor tool here. As usual though, keep in mind, unused RAM is wasted RAM. Next up, I got some tips for both GNOME and KDE here. So one, by default, GNOME only has a close button. It doesn't have a minimize or a maximize button. So if we go back into the Refine app right here and go over to Shell and Compositor, we can end up dragging these onto the window, and so now we'll have maximize and minimize buttons. Additionally, a very common complaint I hear about GNOME is that it doesn't have desktop icons. So to fix this, I recommend a extension called GDK4 desktop icons, and here it is, and boom, now we have desktop icons. And lastly, another very common complaint of GNOME is it doesn't have tray icons out of the box, which makes it so apps like Discord are impossible to close, because if you close it normally, it just goes to the tray icon. So I'm gonna install just a random app here that comes with a tray icon to demonstrate this. And the extension you're going to want to enable tray icon support is the App Indicator and K-Status Notifier Item Support extension. So if I install that, Now when I open this app, I actually have a tray icon here. Sorry, I'm actually going to showcase one more extension that I cannot live without, and that is the extension Caffeine. And so what that does is it adds a little button to the control center, and then it turns off sleep mode or auto suspend on your computer. So I like to do this if I have some sort of long running task and I don't want my computer to suspend if I'm going to like make a cup of coffee or something while I wait. That's another essential extension, at least for me. Now for some KDE tips, if you hit Alt and F2, you'll get access to KRunner. This will let you quickly launch different applications. If I make a little file right here, text file, now KRunner is going to show it right here. This does show up in the search for your start menu too. There's also different KRunner commands. So if I type Google and then I can do just whatever test, that will make a Google search for me inside of Firefox. You can also click right here, and this is some settings, and I like to actually put it in the center of the screen here. Boom. And in the settings, you can also change it to a different keyboard shortcut if you want. So if you have ever heard of Alfred, which is a Mac app that is very popular, this is basically the same thing as that built into KDE Plasma. Also worth noting, you can use KRunner within just your KDE start menu, but KRunner has been a thing in Plasma for a long time, so I'm kind of used to just the Alt F2 on a KDE environment. Another tech tip, if you actually right click on elements of the panel, you can click on show alternatives, and this will give you little alternatives to what it is. So for the application launcher right here, if I want to switch that out, I can switch this to application dashboard, which will give me a full screen launcher here. Or I can go to application menu, which is a little smaller menu that is kind of reminding me of like old Windows XP, Windows 95 type vibe. You can do this too on your task manager. So if I right click, go to alternatives, I can switch it to the icons and text taskbar, which is more like a Windows Vista or Windows XP style taskbar instead of a Windows 7 one. And the final thing I want to show off is the global panel. So if I open, let's say KWrite right here, this is a program that has a little toolbar right here with your file, edit, selection menu, whatever. One of the configurations you can do with Plasma, if I go to the panel editor and I go to add panel, I can add an application menu bar panel. And so now if I reopen this, my application menu is actually part of the desktop rather than part of the window. So this is really good if you're trying to make like a Mac style layout of KDE, because that is a notable user interface element of macOS, is having that application menu bar on the top. And I really wish GNOME had this, to be honest. I'm jealous. Now let's talk about some of the best distributions for each of these desktops. Now, I am not recommending these distributions because they're all different. They all have different use cases. So I would recommend researching the distro, but these are distros that tend to give a pretty good experience for both GNOME or KDE. So for the GNOME experiences, if you're looking for stock GNOME, Fedora is a really good option. Debian's a good option if you want something really stable, but it's going to be an older version. Arch Linux is a very good DIY, build it yourself distro that ships vanilla GNOME. And then we also have a few distros that customize GNOME. So Manjaro has a few tweaks to make GNOME easier to pick up on. Like I think it has dash to dock pre-installed and proper window controls. Ubuntu completely overhauls how it does GNOME because they used to have the Unity desktop, so they switched GNOME to function a bit more like Unity. Zorin OS completely overhauls GNOME, where it's actually a more Windows-like experience and completely different from the standard GNOME workflow. And then Plug, this isn't out just yet, but in about a month you'll be able to experience StillOS, which has a pretty unique implementation of GNOME. Now Zorin OS has something similar to this. This was inspired by Zorin, but we have a little layout switcher that has a bunch of different layouts for GNOME, and you can switch between them all. We have more layouts than Zorin OS does though. And then if you want a really good KDE experience, as I mentioned earlier, Fedora, Debian, and Arch Linux are going to be very good vanilla KDE experiences. There's also KDE Neon, which is sort of a testing ground for KDE. So I don't really recommend this as a daily driver, but you're going to be getting like the most pure KDE experience possible. But again, it's sort of a KDE testing ground. Manjaro also has a pretty good KDE experience. Kubuntu is another good vanilla KDE experience if you want something Ubuntu based. Farron OS is essentially the KDE version of Zorin OS, so it's also very Windows-like and has a little layout switcher. Garuda Linux, not my cup of tea Linux distro, but their KDE version is a very beautiful distro, and it'd be a good thing to take a look at if you want to see how beautiful KDE can really be. Fun fact, SteamOS actually ships with KDE Plasma. So overall, which one would you use? GNOME, it does have a learning curve. You do have to make a few tweaks to make it good. You do have to learn how the GNOME workflow works. That said, on a GNOME desktop, I can just fly when I do work with the GNOME workflow. So this is just like, you want to use your computer to get work done, you want to be able to fly, and you want everything to look super consistent. Whereas KDE is sort of the build it yourself option. It gives you all the tools to form it into a desktop environment that you want it to be. So that this is for tinkerers, power users, and people who want to build their own workflow. With that, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and subscribe. You might also like my video on how to make Linux mainstream, where I talk about some of the issues Linux has that has prevented it from becoming a choice in the mainstream for computers. And I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.